Well, it is a pleasure to be here. It's not early that you get to. It's not often that you get to start early. Normally, these opening things go on, and then the keynotes go. I haven't got enough time. But yeah, look, it's a great privilege to be here, and I want to reiterate the points that have already been made about the value of days like today. I actually never went to an event like this when I was a postgrad, and now I wish I did. It would have given me a lot more insight that I didn't have when I first started to navigate conferences. Well, as the presentation title today suggests, I'm going to spend a little bit of time today talking about grants. Grants, however, are only, they're a structuring pillar of the talk, and it's also my intention to talk about a much broader range of dimensions concerning the work of fledgling academics, including the challenge of crafting a coherent research agenda, how to build a publication portfolio amidst heavy workloads, and a host of other complexities we face as we seek to navigate our way through the early career years. And this is, that's what this picture means. We're navigating this complex, weird-looking world. In canvassing the ground that I'm going to cover today, I'm not going to focus on the finer-grained technicalities of grant writing, because you get a lot of this in other forums. But what I want to do instead is focus more on the academic journey, seeking to reflect and draw insights from my experiences and also the experiences of others, particularly students that I now supervise and colleagues. Before I engage in this task, I want to start with a caveat. That is, I want to acknowledge from the outset that there's a curious line and set of tensions to walk for me in giving a presentation like this. So I've been asked to reflect on my journey, but it's important to emphasise that I'm only just moving out of the early career phase myself. So in many ways, I still feel like I've got a front row seat to many of the challenges and the possibilities that define this particular stage of one's career. So what I'm doing is approaching this talk in the spirit of sharing ideas with contemporaries and with colleagues, rather than claiming to offer any infallible insights. What's more, I'm well aware that my academic journey is not your academic journey. So my hope is that, at best, the insights I provide can, and that I can distill from my experiences, can be adapted and adopted into your narrative and your journey. So, on this idea of journeys, and by the way, I think I'm going to win the award for the most minimalist keynote slides ever produced. There's not many of them. I thought a lot about how to structure this keynote, and what I've settled on is probably a little bit odd in style. But hopefully it's going to make a bit of sense. So, as I said, my hope is to recount the narrative of my journey, but in doing so, I'm going to try and punctuate this narrative with some broader points of advice or lessons that I've learned along the way. In other words, rather than trying to offer a kind of decontextualised list of tips and tricks, which is often the case in areas like this, I'm going to try and embed the insights that I've learned into the narrative itself, so you can see how I arrived at these views. So there's going to be 7 lessons, and again, these are lessons not that I'm saying you must learn, but lessons or conclusions that I've arrived at based on my various failures, successes and so on. And hopefully some of these will be useful. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start the journey more broadly, talking a bit about how I got to the PhD and then what happened in it. And then I'm going to get to the pointier end of things and talk about the research grant world that I now inhabit. And hopefully by the end, this will have all felt like more of a story than a lecture. So, time for the embarrassing photo. Like many of you, I imagine, my journey into academia began in the classroom. Back in the early 2000s, I left Australia actually as a starry-eyed young man with very messy hair, and I took up my first proper teaching position at a school in London in the UK. At 23 years of age, I think it's safe to say I was superbly unprepared for what lay ahead of me. The final school I worked at was in North London, and during the 6 months that I spent at the school, 3 of my students were stabbed, 2 were incarcerated, and 1 was shot. Rather than teaching, most of my days at this school were spent desperately trying to ameliorate the effects of disadvantage. And my research career that followed was really born in the substance of those tough days that I spent in London schools. Because it was during those formative years that I really began to puzzle over the role that schools play in the making of people and the making of societies, but particularly the role that education policy plays in this. So in 2008, I carried these various questions into my PhD at the University of Melbourne, and I focused the PhD on equity policies in Australian schooling. And looking back on it, I was superbly naive to the world of academia when I went into it. My motivations to go into academia were based solely in personal intellectual passions, particularly a passion to understand more about how schooling worked. But as I learned, passion doesn't always translate into lucidity. For me, the first year of my PhD was a terrifying wake-up call. So many times I questioned my ability, but also my suitability for academia. I often felt underread, I always felt underprepared, and I often felt below the academic standard of my peers. Basically, I was terrified that I was out of my depth. And there was a little bit of class warfare going on here as well, because for me, unlike many of my peers at the University of Melbourne, I hadn't come through a privileged academic pipeline. I didn't come from an elite private school to an elite university. To borrow from the rock and roll poet Noel Gallagher, I felt like a man with a fork in a world of soup. Come on, that's funny. Fork, soup, it's not very useful. And I wasn't sure if I was going to tell this particular story, but one night my partner came home from work and found me rocking head in hands in the bathtub like a lost child. And she said, what's going on? And my supervisor had given me the first proper feedback on a piece of writing that I'd submitted, and it absolutely cut it to shreds. Absolutely, like I was completely grounded by the experience. In fact, when I did my master's, which was a few years before that, my supervisor essentially thought I was the best, student he'd ever had. So everything I did was praised, and I was expecting this level of praise, and I was essentially given feedback which suggested maybe I should rethink my career choice. So this brings me to lesson number 1, which is humility. And I want to start with this one because I think it's important early on to accept that there is much that you do not know. Like many teachers who go on to do research degrees, I came from schools where you had to at least sound like you knew what you were talking about, and you had to sound like you were sure of yourself most of the time. So it was hard to sort of make a shift to be humbler in terms of what one does know and what one doesn't know. And humility, I learned, was central to being open to learning. And I soon discovered that if I was going to make it in the academic world, I'd need to accept that there's always going to be more that I don't know than I do know. But I actually started to see this as a positive because not knowing things led me to want to know things. And as I persisted, I think I started to slowly get more of a grip on this world of academia and as Bourdieu says, a feel for the game. Another major realisation I had during the early phase of my PhD was the importance of getting out there and getting to know people. At the time, like in the first 6 months or so, the idea of academic conferences seemed quite alien to me. But I kept getting told by my supervisors and other people how important it was for me to go to these conferences. So the first conference I applied to go to was AARE, which is, the American conference, and it's a big one. And I applied for a small travel grant to get me over there. And, looking back on it, AARE was intimidating, to say the least. If you ever want to feel totally insignificant, that's the place to go. Despite... so I was really nervous at the conference. I totally felt out of my depth and just didn't really know how to negotiate it. But what I did do, which looking back on, I think was a good idea, I took the bold step of emailing a whole host of academics before I went and asking them if they wanted to catch up for coffee. And the way I figured it at the time was more an economic rationalisation. Like, I was spending so much going over there, I thought I should probably get the most out of this and meet some people while I'm there. And these people I emailed were gods of my field, the kind of people whose books lay well worn and scribbled in all over my desk. But to my surprise, I found these gods to be surprisingly welcoming, and on the whole were incredibly gracious with their time. And I'm sure I bumbled my way through these conversations with them and said a whole lot of stupid stuff. But what was good about that is I started to get an early taste for the kind of social world of academia, or the importance of actually getting to know people outside of just what they do. What's your research about? How's your kids? Stuff like that. Things that sort of... are more than just the transactional nature of academia. And this brings me to lesson number 2, which is go places. Reach out and start building networks. So if your experiences are anything like mine, the PhD is going to absolutely fly by. And from the word go, you kind of need to start planning your schedule. Like, where are you going to go? What are you going to do? What papers are you going to write? And how's all that going to fit together? Now that I supervise my own PhD students, I tell them that conferences are really crucial, but not just so that you can go and give papers or listen to papers, but because they're about building networks. And actually, I think that's what conferences are really about. And often those networks are over a coffee or a beer or things like that. And I don't think the importance of this can be overstated. I think that being isolated during your PhD or the early career years is pretty much the worst state of affairs you can find yourself in. The PhD itself is already an isolating process. I'm sure many of you can relate to that. So you need to make every opportunity you can to connect with other people, people who are like-minded and not like-minded, but also people who are junior and senior. So you get a sort of breadth of a view there. And I think, partly networking is about being strategic, and I don't think that there's any point in pretending otherwise. But because the networks that you make now could very well lead, and they did for me, to opportunities in the future, whether they're research collaborations or co-authored publications or research grants. But it's not just about getting known or being strategic. For me, and this still holds up, the main benefit of networks for me is intellectual enrichment. They are ways through which you can share knowledge. You can take part in the conversations that define your field, and you can be challenged. And I think being challenged is particularly important. For me personally, after AARE, which was my first big conference, it wasn't long after that another opportunity, and a fairly big one in retrospect, presented itself for me to build kind of transnational academic networks. One of my supervisors had received a fairly prestigious fellowship at the University of Cambridge, and I thought, I'm going to go visit. This is a good idea to go over there. And so, again, I managed to get a really small research grant just internally, which was nowhere near it. I think it paid for my airfares. But it just gave me that edge, so it allowed me to spend some time in Cambridge at the university there. And, just as a kind of pointer, I think those little grants that you think, they're just, $2,000, $3,000, they can be really important for actually opening up a window for you during the PhD process. For me personally, I mentioned the Cambridge experience because it was a turning point for me in my PhD, because it was during those months that I really started to commit myself to getting a hold over what it was that I was doing in my PhD, because there's a lot of floating that takes place in the early years. But I really started to read voraciously. Like I was reading, multiple chapters, journal articles, books, or, every day I was churning through stuff because I was free from the constraints of normal life. So I was in a kind of a bubble that allowed me to really work through things. And there was an impact, not that I recognised it so much at the time, but there was a real impact of this deep reading because it allowed me to get a sense for where my work was positioned in relation to the fields of policy and sociology, which are my kind of key areas. And as a result, I started to feel more confident. So I would go into discussions with people feeling a little bit more confident about what I was doing, and also in terms of getting a hold on theories and things like that. And before I left Cambridge, I gave a seminar at the Graduate School of Education there and had really good feedback from the people who came along. And it was the first time where I started to get a sense of mild validation over the work that I was doing. And the idea that of fitting into academia started to feel like more of a realistic possibility. So this is really leading to my third point, which I really do think is the most important point of the day, which is know thy field. Know where you sit and know what you might be able to contribute. So this idea of knowing one's... By the way, I put a lot of effort into these images, choosing images that really sum up the point in the absence of text, because, who isn't sick of PowerPoints filled with millions of words? I think that the idea of knowing one's field, which is what I'm getting at here, it applies just as much to the PhD as it does to competitive research grants and everything that happens in your career after that. And this is where I'm going to start talking a bit about grants. Just like the PhD, the majority of research grants, whether they're little grants during your PhD or big ones afterwards, usually ask you to clearly articulate where your work is positioned. So and often in a very fine-grained way, to articulate what your work and your project will do that will add new knowledge. So this is easier said than done, right? Much easier said than done. And as I explained, I started my research journey rocking madly back and forth in a bathtub before I started to get any sense of clarity over what I was doing. As someone who is a few years on now and I've started assessing research grants, I want to suggest to you that unsuccessful applications are very often those that don't clearly articulate the research field to which they are speaking. And I want to suggest that there's three common problems that I see now as a grant assessor which regularly hold back grants, and which is actually really useful for me in writing my own grants. So I think first you get the kind of grants that don't reflect any strong understanding of the field in relation to which the project is positioned, and as a result, no clear articulation of how the project will contribute new knowledge. So these sort of applications are almost always, in my experience, ruled out as not competitive from the start. So they might be a really good idea, or they might, you might have a good research track record, but if you can't show what it is that you're doing that's new or that adds new knowledge to your area, you're very unlikely to get funded. The second problem is those applications that do flag positioning in relation to a field, but then either don't clarify what that actually means or provide references that don't seem to fit with that field. So this problem is kind of better than the first one, but it still gives the impression of lacking coherency, or maybe suggests to the reader that you lack conceptual foundations or that you lack methodological foundations. The third problem is where applicant, again, does try and flag position in relation to a field, but then brings together different or conflicting perspectives. And that might be conflicting conceptual pieces or conflicting methodological perspectives, but then doesn't explain how or why they fit together, or how or why bringing them together could be generative or add something new. Again, this is better than the first two problems, but it's still a problem if you want to get funded. So as bad as it sounds, and I'm not trying to be too negative here, but assessors are often looking for reasons not to fund research grants. So there's always limited money, there's always limited grants, and success rates are often frightfully low. So any sign that a project lacks the kind of foundations that I'm talking about can easily be construed as a reason for not funding it, especially relative to other projects that could be quite competitive. So to bring all this back to my Cambridge experiences, the best advice I think I can give you for knowing your field is to read, and be really systematic in how you organise your readings and notes. I definitely wasn't systematic in how I organised my readings and notes, which caused me a lot of pain when I had to actually write the thesis up. I now encourage all my students to read at least one journal article or chapter every day and stick to it. And I always ask them, what have you read, in the last week or so? And I developed this habit in about the last 6 months of my PhD, but I try and stick with it now still. Because it keeps me up to date with what's going on. But I also think it's important to also try and read not just theory and concepts. People often get down big, deep rabbit warrens in that sense, but also give a decent amount of time to reading about methodology. Because when you apply for grants, being able to fastidiously outline your research design of your project and to situate it methodologically is just as important as theoretical sophistication. Particularly when you apply for big grants like ARCs, the design of the actual project and whether that methodology is feasible and also links to the aims of the project is really important. So ultimately I want to sum this point up by saying basically you should read a lot. But it's only by engaging in this sort of deep reading that you get a sense for your work and your field and what you might be able to contribute. And so through reading, you start to get a sense for who the key players are in your field, what the emerging arguments and problems are, but particularly problems. A lot of people, and I did this many times myself, you get a grip on the key arguments and then you repeat the arguments. But if you want to kind of get grants, you need to show how you're going to take those arguments forward into new pastures. And through this, hopefully you get a sense for what you're going to do that's different or unique. So coming back to my story, after I left Cambridge, I started to enter into the second half of my PhD. And it was like, I don't know what it was exactly, but suddenly I started to freak out because it occurred to me that in like a year and a half, I'd be entering the unforgiving world of the academic job market. And going into the PhD, I was incredibly naive to many aspects of academia, but I wasn't naive to the realisation of the need to publish. When I did my master's, my supervisor back then was always hammering into me, publish or perish, publish or perish. And so he really pushed me to publish an article out of my master's thesis, which I did do. And that was my only publication going into the PhD. But I was very aware from the beginning that I needed to do this. I needed to publish. What I didn't realise, though, and this is where I think maybe I can offer some useful points, it's not. I started to realise it wasn't just about actually getting runs on the board, but I actually had to. My publication portfolio had to demonstrate some sort of coherency. It had to sort of say something about me as a researcher or say something about what my particular agenda was. And so as the PhD progressed, I started hearing people say things like, you've got to have a strong research track record, or you've got to, you've got to have a research agenda. And at first I did misconstrue this as just meaning you've got to publish heaps, like you've got to write a lot. But as my knowledge deepened, I started to realise it wasn't just about lots. It was also about quality of what you were publishing and coherency of the overall record. And I'm not saying that my record is entirely coherent, because it's only really the last couple of years I've really started to think about this. But you want to be able to show that you're a scholar with emerging expertise in a particular area. And often people go straight to your publications to try and get that sense. I also started to become aware of this idea of high-impact publications. And I didn't really get what that meant in the beginning, but after a while I started to realise it basically just means publishing the best journals that you can. You know, they have the highest citation indexes and things like that. Once I started to think about all these things, and because I had a few minor successes with getting things published, I thought I need to make an impact. I need to get out there, and so I decided, which was pretty bold, I think, in retrospect, to suggest to a colleague who was a bit more experienced than I was, let's do a special issue in a journal. Let's propose a special issue. So we put in a special issue proposal to Critical Studies in Education. And it was a really quite tedious process and a lot of work involved going back and forth, but we had the issue accepted in the end. And so I was feeling pretty good. I'm thinking I'm in my second year of my PhD, I'm publishing a special issue, but it was incredibly hard though. And it was also, I found myself in this position of being on the other side as a guest editor. But the reason I mention it is because it was incredibly useful for me in thinking about how you do something that's actually different or is trying to take the field forward. Because if you write a journal article, you've kind of got to do that in a minor sense. But if you do a special issue, you've got to say, we're making some sort of a statement here about the field or where it's going. So for me, that was really, really useful to be involved in that. And it was a privilege as well to do it. So you're not going to be surprised by lesson number 4. Really, writing and publishing is the key to everything. And it's intimately connected to knowing one's field. They're like chicken and egg. But the writing game itself has almost countless dimensions. So whether it's writing your thesis or writing a journal article or writing a consultancy report or a grant application, it's often the quality of your writing and the ability to craft a coherent and convincing narrative. It's often the deciding factor in determining success. And because you've probably had the importance of publish or perish drilled into you a million times already, rather than just hammering that point on and on, what I want to do instead is to draw a distinction between something I've only just started thinking about recently, which is the difference between quantity and quality when it comes to publications, particularly in relation to research grants. So firstly, let me say something about quantity. So again, the advice to publish or perish has never been more relevant. Publication metrics, for better or worse, have become the primary mechanism by which you are now judged as an academic. Your Google Scholar Citation Index, your ResearchGate score, these are things that are now being used to judge your impact and your effectiveness as an academic. And as I said, for better or worse. But again, in what's a classic example of chicken and egg, publication metrics determine success on grants, but then grants provide you the opportunities to publish more, and then the cycle goes on and on and on like this. So in relation to grants, quantity is something that I've seen used with a brutal touch or applied with a brutal touch. I was recently on a committee for an early career research grant award when the quantity of journal articles alone was the primary measure that was used to shortlist applicants. So you might say that this is very crude and perhaps unfair, but the thing is, when you're looking at a highly competitive field of many, many, many more applicants than can fill the positions, these things become deciding factors. They become ways of, shortlisting things down. And look, I don't think there's a magic recipe to increase output There's just not. But one piece of advice I give my students now is that you should develop a publication plan or a strategy from the very first day of your PhD. And this sort of seems like quite foreign to some students. They're like, what? I didn't even know I had to publish, let alone have a plan. But I think it's really important because you can say, look, aspirationally, I want to achieve this, this, and this by the end of this year, and then by the end of next year. And then, it may not always work out that way, but you keep revising it and thinking through it as you get runs on the board and go along. The other thing I say to my students, and this is something that I kind of religiously operate my own life by, is I try and quarantine at least 2 hours of writing time a day. And when I say quarantine, like email off, like door shut, phone off if you have to, whatever it is, and I just write. And you'd be surprised how much you can get done if you write for 2 hours a day, 5 days a week. Like this, and if you do it at a time when you're productive, like in the morning, after a strong coffee and you're ready to go, that's 10 hours of really productive writing. You can get a lot done. Because time is your biggest enemy in academia and life in general. But I think time is also your most precious asset. So you've kind of got to be militant in how you apportion time in your life, just generally, again, and in academia. Also, no matter how much you love your research, there'll inevitably be moments where you just want to pick up that laptop, smash it against the wall and never write another bloody word again. So for me, because of this, which is inevitable, those moments, you kind of, or I have to treat writing like a job. I've got to do it whether I feel like doing it or not every day. And funnily enough, this is advice that many novelists give when asked about how they have become successful creative writers. So another key here is that you need to, I had to learn how I write best, so like learn how you write best. Because I personally, I don't just write beautiful prose, and who does? I always have to start with really structured dot points, like what is it I want to say, and then I break it down into sections, an article, and then I dot point in the sections, and then I elaborate on the dot points, and then eventually I have an argument. And once I've got an argument, it's actually generally pretty easy to write once I get to that stage. And again, I also write better in some environments than others. Always in the morning, always after a strong coffee. But, what works for me won't necessarily work for you. So it's just about finding that rhythm. So let me talk about quality. So quantity is only part of the game. Something I've only learned very recently is that it's very important not to confuse the idea of publish or perish with publish anything anywhere. Again, I've only recently come to this realisation. Now, in your early days of your career, there might be some merit in getting runs on the board in lower stakes journals or different outlets. But ultimately, I think you have to start aiming at least to get published in the best journals in your field from early on. And, you won't always do it, and we all have rejections, but at least start aiming in that direction. Because I think without getting some of these more higher stakes publications on your CV, it's increasingly unlikely that you're going to be competitive in post-PhD job markets or research grant markets. I have a friend at a uni I won't name who recently applied for a postdoc position, and there were 357 applicants for one position, right? So my experience from being on panels for employment, but also for grants, is that when you're comparing a field of really competitive people, obviously quantity, yes, it's important, but often then when they've all got a lot of publications, what actually matters is quality. There's no magic number for what you have to have published in quantity, but once you're seen as kind of having enough, like, oh, this person's published enough, they've done, they're in the field or whatever. The conversation then turns to what they've published and where they've published it. And we hear the word impact all the time, and often the journal is a kind of surrogate measure for impact. So you've published in a top journal that has a high citation index, so this person is a quality scholar. So it's a kind of leap that gets made there. And it's not an insane leap, right? Because the journals that get the highest citation counts and they're the hardest to get published in are also the ones with the most rigorous review processes. They're the hardest to get published in, and they often get reviewed by people who are leaders in the field. So I think there's a good reason there to say that they represent something good about you as a scholar. Over the years, I've said yes to far too many things. I mean, you can look up, we all have our public portfolios out there. You can look up my publications. I've said yes to far too many low-stakes publications, particularly book chapters that I've done as favours to friends or people who are doing books, that took a huge amount of time, but really don't mean much when it comes to applying for grants. And I've just moved to a university where, and there's reasons for this, but I've moved to a university where a journal article counts as 5 points and a book chapter counts as 1. Right, so for me, and some of those book chapters I published could easily have been journal articles, but I received 5 times less credit for doing that. And obviously you want to help. If you know someone who's publishing a book and you think it's good to be involved, of course you've got to do things like that. And I'm writing 2 book chapters now, but I think you just need to be a little bit careful about where you publish and think about how it's going to kind of work for you in the future. Because if you're in the second year of your PhD, just from an example, I mean, you kind of got to think if I want to apply for that research grant in 2 years' time, what do I want my portfolio to look like? And what have people who've got these awards, what have their portfolios looked like? Because it gives you a sense, and in fact, this is exactly, I've got a few colleagues at a university at the moment who've been asked to pinpoint successful DECRA applicants and find out exactly what their publication portfolios look like at the point of their application, and to then sort of think about where they sit in relation to that. And it might sound insane, right? But it gives you a kind of useful perspective on where you might need to be and what you might need to do in the years that are coming up. But again, I want to reiterate that it's easy to talk about these things in retrospect. And when I was in the position of being a PhD student, I knew very little about these ins and outs. At the start of my 3rd year of my PhD, I went to a session at the University of Melbourne on applying for early career research grants. And at the session, someone described research grants as a roller coaster, like highs, lows, but also likened the research grant world to a secret club. Kind of like it looks mysterious from the outside and it's really hard to get into. But then once you're in, success breeds success, which breeds success, and so on. It's kind of like the academic Freemasons. My grandfather was a Freemason, but I only found that out recently. And totally irrelevant to the conversation we're having, but just thought I'd throw that in there. So the idea is that, getting the first grant is hard often, but then getting the second grant is easier because you've got the first one, and third because of the second, fourth, and so on. And so this idea made sense to me at the time. I thought, well, there's a lot of logic in that, but it also scared the hell out of me. Because I'd got a couple of little travel grants here and there, which a lot of my peers had got. But I'd done a little bit of AARE work for my supervisors. But, I was going into the 3rd year of my PhD. I had no experience managing my own research grants or getting my own research grants. And then a colleague is, just in case I needed some more beating down, a colleague told me that if you don't have experience working on grants, like someone else's grant, or getting your own before you finish your PhD, you're not going to get a job. And I kind of thought, how have I missed this fundamental aspect? Is this real? Is this the thing that's actually happening? And then I realised it was real, and it was a thing that was actually happening. And years later, I realised that, you put people who are leaving their PhDs and applying for jobs, often have, people with significant grant experience already or significant research experience applying for jobs. That's the field that you're going into. So for me, I thought I need to get serious about this. I need to do something about this. I wasn't exactly sure what to do about it. Then a job came up. So I'd started thinking about, I need to get a job next year, all this sort of stuff. And a research fellow position came up, and a position was advertised, working full-time for 3 years on an ARC linkage project. And it was at the University of Melbourne. And it seemed great for me. Like it was on aspects of national schooling reform, so it aligned with my interests. So I put the idea to my supervisors. So I had 6 months to go by this stage of my PhD. I had a rough draft of a thesis, a full rough draft, but it was pretty rough. I had a long way to go, more than I realised at the time. Now, one of my supervisors could see the benefits from my point of view, for my career, but had pretty major concerns about it derailing the thesis. The other was pretty cold on the idea, to be honest. Both of my supervisors, and I find this really interesting in retrospect, because both of my supervisors saw me and my work as more aligned with sociology of education rather than policy. So I saw myself as both. And they sort of, they were supportive, obviously, but they warned me against what could happen if I went too far down the policy line, because it's such a competitive area and it's dominated by a couple of key scholars, and you need to think about that if you go down that line. But at the end of the day, you got to make your own decisions. So I applied for the job thinking, may as well, and then I got it. Right, so that's great. I got a job, but they were right about the next 6 months being incredibly difficult. Not just the next 6 months. I mean, it was so hard that I found myself, applying for an extension on the thesis, working 7-day weeks, writing at nights, things like that. But it was a major turning point for me, and I'm glad I did it, because it opened up a whole range of opportunities in the years to follow that may never have come if I didn't do it. Because it was working on that ARC project, particularly a linkage project that was in partnership with policy organisations, that kind of opened up the world of commissioned work, consultancy work, and the engagement that you can make with policymakers in doing research. So it was a completely different side of academia that I, to that point, knew nothing about. And it really opened up my networks, and particularly with policy people. And it instilled in me a sense for ways of kind of speaking and writing that are going to attract funding. Ways that are going to be look like they make a difference in a public sense. So this is a sort of, and I say this with great respect for my supervisors. But, I think it's important for everyone to treat the supervision relationship very carefully. It can be complex terrain. And I say this again, not just based on my own experiences, but based on my experience now of supervising my own students and witnessing other students be supervised. I think that supervisors can be incredibly enabling forces, but they can also be incredibly disabling forces for fledgling academics. So they play a powerful role in contouring the conditions of possibility for your future as an academic. But as I've sort of tried to say, sometimes I think we need to take risks, we need to ignore their advice, and we need to carve out our own space in the research world. And so perhaps the best advice I can give current students in the room is that I think you should seek to kind of consume as much expertise and knowledge from your supervisors as you can, and to learn from their experiences, but also be sure to assert some autonomy over shaping your own future and your own academic work. Because as your work progresses, you need to start becoming your own academic and an expert in your area and take ownership over it. And I think that too much hand-holding can be really detrimental to your career. And this is particularly true, I think, as you enter the last stages of your PhD and you actually have to start thinking about, defending, creating, producing your own research portfolio, applying for your own grants without support from others, and carving out your own space in the world. So for me, I had to take a risk and move partially against the advice of my supervisors to actually get my first academic job. And while they were absolutely true in saying that it would slow down the PhD and be a hampering force in that regard, ultimately it was a minor blip on the radar. Like 6 months means nothing in the big scheme of things. And especially when you compare it to the advantages that for me flowed from that position. But I also want to say that mentors, and you probably all know this already, but mentors should and can extend far beyond the supervision space. And for me, I've had a lot of good mentors over the years I've never had a formal relationship with, through supervision or other things. And I was also very fortunate to have good mentors on that ARC project, one in particular, the late Jack Keating, who saw me as more than just a publication workhorse for his project, but actually saw me as an emerging scholar who needed support to carve out my own research trajectory. And so Jack gave me quite a lot of autonomy. I mean, he still wanted me to get the work done on the project, obviously, but he encouraged me to apply for my own research grants and to do my own things. And for me, this allowed me to apply for some smaller grants, so kind of entree into the world of grants. So I applied for 2 grants during that time, both from Melbourne University. One was a very small seed funding grant and the other one was a slightly larger early career grant. And I started to see these grants as stepping stones. Like I thought, okay, these are stepping stones to applying for a DECRA. So, the Discovery Early Career Research Award, DECRA by the ARC, this I was told was the pinnacle towards which I should be aspiring, and I started to see that as my next goal. And in going through these processes, I started to realise that to get a DECRA, I'd not only need to have this successful PhD and great publication portfolio and all this sort of stuff, but I'd actually need to have an emerging research agenda, so an agenda, not just a portfolio, that transcended the PhD, that moved beyond it, and that was worthy of public funding at the national level. So, why should taxpayers' money fund me for 3 years to do something? So as things progressed, I guess I should say, let me divert for a second and say things progressed well for a little while. So I was working on these small grants, I was working on as a research fellow, but then about a year or so into this work, and once the PhD was well out of the way, things got progressively more complicated. So I realised that I'd started falling into a trap that many of us fall into, and it was basically just taking on too much. So again, with my mentors being supportive, they suggested that if I wanted to have a job after I finished the fellowship, I'd need to have a decent amount of teaching experience as well. So I've talked mainly about research up to this point. But, they said essentially you need to get experience teaching at the university level because you need both, research and teaching to get a job. And so I started to do this, but essentially what I was doing is just piling stuff on. So I still had a full-time research fellow position. I was taking on teaching. I had these 2 little grants on the side. And then with 6 months left before the end of the fellowship, I said yes to a huge coordination role in the Master of Teaching program at Melbourne Uni. And again, it's a double-edged sword, right? Because on the one hand, I think without taking on that big coordination role, I might not have got a job after I finished the research fellow position. But, it was nearly the death of me. And there was a point around 2013, the end of 2013, where I felt that my self-sacrificing to academia was taking a real toll on me personally. And I remember one meeting with my mentor at the time, and we actually calculated up my workload based on the university's workload model. And we worked out that I had a workload of 2.2. So I had more than 2 jobs that I was doing. And that wasn't even including the early career research grant that I was supposed to be doing, which wasn't counted as part of the workload. So with all this in mind, I'm bumbling along wondering how I'm going to kind of keep my head above water. And then I got asked to be a principal researcher on a bid for a major commission grant to evaluate the national teaching standards. So, this is awesome. I mean, I'm having opportunities thrown at me in this case, but I'm bursting at the seams. So I say, yes, sure, yes, let's do this. Let's put in this grant. And then we get it. And we get $1.25 million to do this grant, right? So it's a big one. And so without going into too much sordid personal detail, I had a real powerful realisation during this period, and it was, you are never going to be protected by academia. You are never going to be protected by academia. It will always take more from you, want more from you, demand more from you. There'll always be more that needs to be published. There'll always need to be new grants that need to be applied for, and there'll always be students who need new essays marked or journals that need you to review their articles and so on and so on. So I realised that if I didn't start to protect myself, I was actually going to die, essentially. And what really brought me to this realisation wasn't like a health crisis or anything like you often hear people talk about, but I was out for dinner with some colleagues in 2014, and they were all having this really in-depth conversation about this new special issue that came out. I hadn't even heard of it. I hadn't read it. They were all engaged in this conversation about this new, idea, a new thing that was going on in the education policy space. I was totally out of the loop. I hadn't read the special issue, never even heard of the concept they were talking about. And so despite working constantly, day and night, I was actually falling behind. I was still managing to publish out of my PhD, but I was writing at night time or I was writing on the weekends, and my ability to actually engage in new ideas was drying up. So basically, when I look back on it, I was trading off my previous accomplishments, but I had nothing new coming. I had no extra time to read, no time to develop new ideas or thinking. Basically, I was serving multiple masters, but in doing that, I was running myself into the ground. So I think lesson number 6 for me is look after yourself and be kind to yourself. And yeah, sure, it's easy to engage in platitudes about well-being and work-life balance and positive emotions, but it really is important. It's of crucial importance. And if you want to be, kind of neoliberal about it, it's not just important for your health and personal well-being, it makes you more productive as an academic. I can name countless colleagues who work themselves into the ground like I was, but rarely publish, rarely have time to apply for research grants, and then can't find their way out of that position that they're in. And so I'm not sure there is a balance, but if there is a balance, finding it is hard. Academia, again, is a job where there's always multiple opportunities to be overworked and overwhelmed. Many professionals have a sick day and they lie around binge watching Netflix or something amazing like that. I'd love to do that. You find most academics sick in bed, trying to mark essays or catch up on emails or make final touches on an overdue paper. So it's the kind of job that never goes away, and it's really hard to switch off or even justify switching off. And I often feel like if I let my foot off the pedal, I'm going to fall behind, and that's a pretty bad feeling to have. And then even when things are going well, there's always the anxiety of never doing enough. And that's never going to go away, but you've got to kind of deal with it. So for me, there were at least 2, maybe 3 solid years where I felt like I was working all the time, but going nowhere. And there weren't any easy solutions for me, but basically the way I worked my way through that was to do a couple of things. in short, I wasn't being taken advantage of. And, you know, easier said than done. I tried to extricate myself from various responsibilities that were working to my detriment, and there were many. I tried to take time out for exercise and time with loved ones. I tried not to check emails out of office hours, and I still don't do that, very rarely actually. I say no to things that promise much work and no reward, and I try and be kind to myself and set realistic expectations. So for me, understanding these rhythms are all part of the ebb and flow of academia, a profession that's sometimes marked by intense periods of productivity and creativity, but other times where we feel weary and bogged down. So for me, the realisation that I needed to change the way I worked directly coincided with my shift in attention towards getting serious about applying for a DECRA. And in early 2014, I dedicated myself to this task. That was the key thing I was working towards. And so one of the key things I did is I started carving out time again for reading and writing. And reading and writing specifically linked to that task. So given that DECRA has a success rate of around 10 to 15% in any given year, I went into the process thinking, I'm probably not going to get this, right? Like that's the most likely outcome. So what I thought is I need to have a few fallback options and things on the side. So I also applied for a Spencer Foundation grant in the US, and I applied for a Fulbright scholarship. And I had no success with either of them. But when I didn't get the Spencer, and in fact I never heard anything from them, so I assume they just didn't like what I was doing. But it made me think, you know, am I pitching this right? Do I have good ideas? Then I refined some things and went into the Fulbright. I got interviewed for the Fulbright and shortlisted, and I actually thought I had it. Like they were talking to me like, you've got this, you know. I walked out feeling really confident, and then I didn't get it. So these two rejections that I had in the year before the DECRA application, they did have me questioning, firstly, whether my ideas were good enough. They also had me questioning how I was trying to pitch the thing itself. But then I also realised, you know, you actually have to become very, very comfortable with getting rejected, often. And I also realised that the process of not getting the grants, I felt was making me better at writing grants. So as I started to rework things for the DECRA, it's not like I was just writing it from fresh. You know, I had the little grants that were leading up to it. I had these two unsuccessful ones. And then I tried to synthesise all this into something that I thought was really effective. And then I started to think, I'm going to start reading my own work like I'm the harshest of assessors. You know, so when it started to get a little bit more refined, I literally went through every line going, why shouldn't this be funded? Like, what reason is this person giving me not to fund this research? How can I see this as invalid or weak in a particular area? And in doing this, I started to think, you know, I actually need to create a narrative here, not just to say this is a great project and I have a good track record, but like I'm the right person to do this project. Because when I did a first really critical read of it, I thought, okay, it all makes kind of sense, but like I don't think I'm justifying why I should be the one doing this, like why I'm the person to do this project. And so I then started giving, once it was more refined, I gave it to senior colleagues, junior colleagues, and said, please be critical. Like, tell me what's not working here and tell me what's working. And this was really useful. It was also kind of annoying in some cases because sometimes I got advice from really trusted senior colleagues that was completely contradictory, you know, to the extent of, take that out. That's great. The same thing. So I realised I had to make a call and I had to ignore some advice and I had to, you know, make my own decisions. But overall, it was very useful to have other people read it because I could see it through their eyes and see what... And I would often say to people, so what do you think I'm trying to do in this project? And if they said something that was totally different, then I'd be like, well, I'd really need to rethink how I'm pitching this. But by the end, most people said, you know, you want to study the effects of national schooling reforms on state education departments and agencies. And I'm like, yes, that's what I want to do. So by the time I actually submitted the DECRA, I felt very, very tired, very exhausted, battle-worn, hardened, and all those metaphors. But I felt exhausted in a really good way, actually. Like, I remember thinking, I've done the best job that I can do on this particular grant and this particular idea. I felt like I couldn't write any better, and if I wasn't going to get it, I just wasn't going to get it. I can't do any better than what I just did. And this brings me to lesson number 7, which is my last one for the day. And I'm not going to go on about this one. Don't you love this image? I thought this really sums up what I'm trying to say. I've already said a lot about this already, so I'm not going to go on about it. But one thing I will say is that never underestimate how time flies by when you're leading up to the submission of a particular grant, whether it's a small one or a big one. So in planning for a major grant like an ARC, my advice to myself and to other people is to start preparing your ideas and sketching out your plan, maybe a couple of different plans, because you might have a lot of different things you want to do, at least a year before it's due. And then I think you should try, and I want to apply for another grant in a couple of years, and I know which one it is. So my plan is to have, a full draft 6 months before, so that I can do all that stuff I just said, like send it around to people, be critical of it, walk away from it for 2 weeks, come back to it again, do all that kind of stuff. Because it gives you that time to refine, to redraft, to really think about it, and so on. So I remember this really clearly. It was a Friday morning, and I was about to fly to Thailand with a group of my students on an international study trip. I had all my bags in my arm, and I was checking my phone on the way out the door, and I had this email from my research manager with the subject heading, "You got it." And I was like it's quite embarrassing, actually. I quite dropped to the ground, yeah! Totally surreal. I just couldn't believe it, actually. I'm thinking if they got something wrong here. But I was basically got the DECRA. I was given 3 years of funded research to do the work that I wanted to do, which is great. And it's a great privilege and a great honour to do it. In the end, though, I put the success of that particular grant down to a complex combination of luck and hard work, but mainly hard work. And I actually get annoyed. Sometimes people say things like, "Oh, you're lucky," or, "You got it first time, what a lucky thing." And I get so annoyed because, getting the grant, as I've tried to show, wasn't something that just popped out of the blue, one morning, I got a DECRA. But nor was it just random luck, when you read the assessors' reports, I had 5 assessors, and 2 of them were kind of 3 of them were very positive, 2 of them fairly positive, but kind of thought that, it had some problems and things like that. So, even at that level, it wasn't a certain thing, but, the journey itself was a long process, and it was protracted and it was complicated. But there was also several forks in the road where if I'd gone down one road rather than another, it probably wouldn't have happened. So in a part, that's what I've been trying to sort of get at today, is you've got to kind of think about every kind of decision that you make and think, where might this lead me in the future? Over the past year and a half, so I'm sort of just past the halfway point of the DECRA, again, I've become acutely aware of what a privilege it is to have this, and I want to make sure I make the most out of it. But it's also made me think, actually getting this grant has given me this enormous opportunity to take my career in new directions and actually think more about what I do as an academic and where I'm going, and what my field is and what I can do. And so it's given me this kind of partially insulated space. I say partially insulated because all the other pressures don't just magically disappear. But it's given me a better sense for where my work fits into the field, and what I might be able to contribute going forward. So having provided that overview of my personal and somewhat chaotic journey through academia, which I might add was quite cathartic to get off my chest, I just want to conclude with some final insights. So I'm not one for sentimental quotes usually, and I apologise for the gendered language, but I think this quote by Nietzsche speaks in many ways to the overarching message I've been trying to develop in today's talk. So academia is a highly curious game. Each year, thousands of hopeful scholars are churned through postgraduate degrees with very little chance of gaining employment at the end, and even less getting the privilege of obtaining highly elusive research grants. Since I embarked on my PhD nearly a decade ago, I've found myself perpetually puzzled, fascinated and inspired by this thing that we call academia. As I've suggested today, academia, the world of academia into which we are emerging, is a tough one. There's many demands, many uncertainties, but also many possibilities. And at times, the lows have felt deflating and the stress has been overwhelming, but the highs have been incredibly rewarding. And I often think to myself how lucky I am to have a job that affords me the autonomy that I have and the room to ponder over the intricacies of the universe and to travel and to meet new people and so on. So in finishing, perhaps the most important thing to stress is that while high-stakes indicators like publication metrics, research grants and so on will continue to contour the possibilities of what the modern academic can be, there still remains significant scope within this to be many different kinds of academic. And there are many different kinds of success. So from those who chase high theory through to those who focus on industry and consultancy work, there's no one path that you have to tread, and rarely will an academic be all these things. When I started out, I was wide-eyed, passionate and incredibly naive, but I guess I like to think I'm a little less so, but I also think that there's a long way to go for me. So overall, I hope that some of the lessons that I've learned might, even just in a small way, help you avoid some of the dark places and make more of the light. So it's been a pleasure speaking with you today, and I appreciate your patience in hearing my story and the insights that I've humbly sought to offer. And there's probably time for us to chat for 5 minutes, or do we have a break? Or?
Well, we're starting at 10:30.
Oh, so there's no time. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, everyone. I look forward to the day.